Ursula K. Leguin's now classic short essay From Elfland to Poughkeepsie has a number of important themes and argued judgments built into it, interconnecting with each other. And we're going to try to disentangle them a bit so we can better understand exactly what is being put forth in this essay, which is a piece of literary criticism. It's also kind of self-referential. Her various worlds could fit into what we're going to call Elfland. So we should start with that. What is Elfland? And that's where she begins the essay, saying, Elfland is what Lord Dunsay called the place. It is also known as Middle-earth and Prydain and the forest of Broceliande and Once Upon a Time, and by many other names. So this is not restricting it just to those paradigmatic texts and narrative universes. You don't actually have to have elves. You don't necessarily have to have, she's going to talk about dragons later on. But there are some defining traits of what she's calling Elfland that she's going to contrast to Poughkeepsie. And before we go into that, we should say, well, what's Poughkeepsie? If you're not familiar with the United States, you might not know what she's referencing by Poughkeepsie. I actually used to teach in Poughkeepsie at Marist College. And, it's not the Poughkeepsie of her day in 1973, but it is, largely the same kind of place. It's a very prosaic spot. There's not a lot of fantasy going on there, although there might be people playing D&D in their homes or watching The Lord of the Rings on Blu-ray or something like that, or in the theater. But Poughkeepsie is supposed to be sort of, an average American place. She actually speculates at one point, what would be the British equivalent of Poughkeepsie? And we could say this about pretty much any country. It's a place where there might be the trappings of fantasy, but there isn't really fantasy. And she's going to use it, she's going to talk about the Poughkeepsie style or approach. So Elfland, as she's going to point out towards the end of the essay, is actually a secondary, she's going to call it universe. Tolkien's word was secondary world. And here we go. She says, in fantasy, there's nothing but the writer's vision of the world. There is no borrowed reality of history or current events, or just plain folks at home in Peyton Place. There is no comfortable matrix of the commonplace to substitute for the imagination to provide ready-made emotional response and to disguise flaws and failures of creation. There is only a construct built in a void with every joint and seam and nail exposed. To create what Tolkien calls a secondary universe, or Tolkien actually said secondary world or subcreation, is to make a new world, a world where no voice has ever spoken before, where the act of speech is the act of creation. The only voice that speaks there is the creator's voice, and every word counts. So genuine fantasy is, in some respects, although it is drawing on, previous things, as we're going to talk about, and measuring itself against prime examples of its genre, it's doing something a bit different. It's not just transposing what we currently have into, wearing armor and facing dragons or something like that. That makes for bad fantasy, or perhaps not fantasy at all. And she goes on and asks the question, well, what is fantasy itself? And she says this is important because fantasy right now is selling well. So she says, what is fantasy? This is very early on. On one level, it's a game, a pure pretense with no ulterior motive whatsoever. It's one child saying to another child, let's be dragons, and then they're dragons for an hour or two. It's escapism of the most admirable kind, the game played for the game's sake. And escapism is, in fact, part of fantasy, but can that be all that there really is to it? She says no. She says on another level, it's still a game, but a game played for very high stakes. Seen thus as art, not spontaneous play, its affinity is not with daydream, but with dream. It's a different approach to reality, an alternative technique for apprehending and coping with existence. It is not anti-rational, but para rational. So anti-rational would be against reason. Para-rational is alongside reason, right? Supplementing. Not realistic, but surrealistic, super realistic, a heightening of reality. Then she says in Freud's terminology, it employs primary, not secondary process thinking. It employs archetypes, which, as Jung warned us, are dangerous things. Fantasy is nearer to poetry, to mysticism, and to insanity than naturalistic fiction is. It is a real wilderness, and here's a key idea, those who go there should not feel too safe, and their guides, the writers of fantasy, should take their responsibilities seriously. So this is something that she thinks is there in all genuine fantasy. Later on, she'll also talk about epic poetry like that of Beowulf or the Iliad, and that is, in many respects, akin to fantasy as well. So fantasy bears, while it's not the same thing as that, it bears similarities to that. She also says that in fantasy, style, it has a fundamental significance, as we're going to see. And this is really the linchpin of the essay, the thing around which all the other distinctions can be argued to turn, particularly that of Poughkeepsie fantasy, which is not really fantasy at all. There's been, she thinks, a commercialization that is taking place, and she's got this wonderful metaphor at the beginning of National Park. She says, what happens when Elfland is considered merely as a place to get away to, when it becomes, a consumer product, some fantasy so that we can watch Game of Thrones and chit-chat about it at our party, the ill-fated Game of Thrones, of course, because the writers ruined it, in part because they didn't understand fantasy. They also didn't understand George R. R. Martin's story as well. And, there's a lot more that can be said about that. But, you could also think of the churn of fantasy novels, many of which are not particularly good. And Leguin is observing this. So she says, what happens when Elfland becomes a place merely to get away to? You know what's happened to Yosemite. Everyone comes not with an axe and a book of matches, but in a trailer with a motorbike on the back and a motorboat on top and a butane stove, 5 aluminum folding chairs, and a transistor radio on the inside. It'd be even worse now, right? Glamping is a prime example of not really camping, They go from park to park, but they never really go anywhere except when one of them who thinks that even the wildlife isn't real gets chewed up by a genuine first-hand bear, or has happened more recently, stupid tourists getting burned in very hot water coming from, hot springs and geysers, right? So fantasy isn't just a nice, safe consumer product. She also talks about a journalization of fantasy towards the very end of it. And I think this is on point as well. She talks about, here we go, the Poughkeepsie style of fantasy is written in a plain and apparently direct prose. Does that make it equal to Tolkien's? Alas, no, it's a fake plainness. It's not really simple, but flat. Notice that distinction. It's not simple prose, it's flat prose. It's not really clear, but inexact. Its directness is specious. Its sensory cues are vague and generalized. The rocks, the wind, the trees are not there, are not felt. The scenery is cardboard or plastic. The tone as a whole is profoundly inappropriate to the subject. To what then is it appropriate? To journalism. It is journalistic prose. In journalism, the suppression of the author's personality and sensibility is deliberate. The goal is an impression, notice the word there, an impression of objectivity. The whole thing is meant to be written fast and read faster. This technique is right, she says, for a newspaper. It is wrong for a novel and dead wrong for fantasy. So this actually leads us to one of the ways in which she talks about this Poughkeepsie style. There's really two sides to it. So one side is this false objectivity, this flatness, this seeming plainness, plain and apparently direct prose, she says. It just happens to have fantasy content. And a great example of this is provided by one of her objects that she uses at the beginning. We'll read both of these things, right? So here's a little excerpt from a book. The persons talking are a duke of the blood royal of a mythical Celtic kingdom, and a warrior magician. Whether or not they succeed in the end will depend largely on Kelson's personal ability to manipulate the voting. Can he? Morgan asked as the two clattered down a half flight of stairs and into the garden. I don't know, Alaric, Nigel replied. He's good, damned good, but I just don't know. Besides, you saw the key council lords, with Ralston dead and Brancoris practically making open accusations. Well, it doesn't look good. I could have told you that at Cardosa. And Leguin goes on and says, you could take this exact prose and set it in Washington, D.C., right? So the two clatter down a half flight of stairs into the White House garden, and they talk about key committee chairmen instead of the key council lords. And her point is, she says, something has gone wrong. The book from which I quoted is not fantasy for all its equipment of heroes and wizards. If it was fantasy, I couldn't have pulled that dirty trick on it by changing 4 words and suddenly transposing it. The content doesn't make it fantasy, right? So that's a good example of this. There's also a long discussion of what she calls mistakenly distancing from the ordinary in one's style. And she runs through a non-exhaustive list of ways in which writers screw up. She goes on and says, style is problematic. Here we go. She says that one of the ways that people make this mistake is they see this distancing done beautifully in old works like Mallory's Morte d'Arthur, and in new books the style of which is grounded on the old books, and they think, aha, I'll do it too. And then she says, but alas, it is one of those things like bicycling and computer programming that you have got to know how to do it before you do it. So our novice says you have to use verbs with thee and thou, so they do, but they don't actually know how to do that, because we don't use thee and thou anymore. Then our novice tries to use the subjunctive. And English writers are not, particularly good at using that because we don't use it an awful lot consciously. We certainly don't teach it anymore, right? All the wases turn into wers and leap out at the reader snarling. Then she goes down further and she says, we aren't through yet. We haven't had the fancy words. Eldritch, tenebrous, smaragds, and chalcedony. Mayhap. It can't be maybe. It can't be perhaps. It has to be mayhap, unless it's perchance. And then comes the final test, the infallible touchstone of the 7th-rate ichor. Ichor, it oozes out of severed tentacles and beslimes tessellated pavements and bespatters bejeweled courtiers and bores the bejesus out of everybody. The archaic manner, she says, is indeed a perfect distancer, but you have to do it perfectly. It's a high wire. One slip spoils all. So archaisms are not actually going to cut it in style. And she goes on, with some other examples as well, making things more complicated than they need to be. And so these are the Poughkeepsie, the two sides, you could say, of the Poughkeepsie approach to writing fantasy short stories and novels, either doing plain and apparently direct prose that you just insert some fantasy content into, or trying to talk like a fantasy person, right? Fantasy, we could call it lingo, but not style. She also discusses some authors in a bit of a digression who have what she's thinking of as mixed styles, where their work is heroic and comic at the same time. And when it's heroic, they speak in a heroic way, but when it's comic, they talk in the ordinary parlance of, whatever time period they're writing. Roger Zelazny, here we're thinking perhaps of the Chronicles of Amber. Fritz Leiber, we could think of the Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser stuff, as well as many others. She also mentions Jack Vance, but she says Vance doesn't do quite the same thing as them. And she says Fritz Leiber and Roger Zelazny have both written in the comic heroic vein. Their technique is to alternate. When humor is intended, they speak colloquial American English or even slang, right? Readers indifferent to language do not mind this, but for others the strain is too great. I am one of those latter. So it's interesting to see her, Zelazny and Leguin are part of the same time and movement. It's often called the new wave of science fiction and fantasy. And here she's criticizing Zelazny for that. She says, it's strange, because both Leiber and Zelazny are skillful and highly imaginative writers, and it's perfectly clear that Leiber, profoundly acquainted with Shakespeare and practiced in a very broad range of techniques, could maintain any tone with eloquence and grace. Sometimes I wonder if these two underestimate their own talents, or they lack confidence in themselves. Or it may be that since fantasy is seldom taken seriously at this particular era, they are afraid to take it seriously themselves, and so their humor becomes self-mocking and self-destructive. Their gods and heroes keep turning aside to look out of the book at you and whisper, see, we're just really plain folks. And she goes on and talks about Vance. He says, his humor is so quiet, you can miss it if you blink. The whole tone of his writing is so modest, sometimes I wonder whether he fails to realize how good of a writer he is. If so, it's probably a result of the patronizing attitude American culture affects towards works of pure imagination. But Vance never compromises with the patronizing and ignorant. He never lets his creation down in order to make a joke, and he never shows a tin ear for tone. The conversation of his characters is aloof and restrained, very like his own narrative prose, an unusual kind of English. It is an achieved style, and it contains no archaisms at all. This leads us to talking about style. A little bit earlier on in the work, she talks about the lords of Elfland. And she does so in the context of bringing up something that is already there discussed in Aristotle's Poetics, which is about tragedy, right? And the great tragedians like Sophocles or Aeschylus or Euripides already knew. Speech expresses character. Not all speech does. But the speech of the characters is how they convey what Aristotle called dianoia, thought, and ethos, character. All right? It does so whether the speaker or author does so or not. When I hear a man say, I could have told you that at Cardoso or at Poughkeepsie or wherever, I think, I know something about that man. He's the kind who says, I told you so. Nobody who says, I told you so, has ever been or will be a hero. The lords of Elfland, she says, are true lords, the only true lords, the kind that do not exist on this earth. Their lordship is the outward sign or symbol of real inward greatness. And greatness of soul shows when a person speaks. At least it does in books. In life, we expect lapses. In naturalistic fiction, we expect lapses and laugh at an over-heroic hero. But in fantasy, which instead of imitating the perceived confusion and complexity of existence, tries to hint, this is a wonderful phrase, at an order and clarity underlying existence. In fantasy, we need no compromise. Every word spoken is meaningful, though the meaning may be subtle. So this is, a very important and robust expression here. She also tells us that if we're going to write fantasy, or if we're going to measure fantasy, we should measure it not against the average, the mediocre, but against the best. And she says that it might seem unfair for me to pick the best, like Edison, Morris, and Tolkien in talking about style, but I don't think it's unfair. In art, the best is the standard. When you hear a new violinist, you don't compare her to the kid next door. You compare her to Stern and Heifetz. If she falls short, you won't blame her for it, but you will know what she falls short of. And if she's a real violinist, she knows it too. In art, good enough is not good enough. Isn't that a great discussion and exemplification of how we should understand this? Later on, she talks about the mistake of thinking that style is something you can just kind of like put on, or to use the other metaphor, season things with. It doesn't work that way, she says. And this is a fundamental mistake that leads people into the Poughkeepsie way of looking at things. Here we go. Many readers, many critics, Most editors speak of style as if it were an ingredient of a book, like the sugar in a cake, or something added onto the book, like the frosting on the cake. You can have a cake without sugar, right? It's not going to be very sweet, but it's still a cake. You can have a cake without frosting, definitely. The frosting is, in many respects, unless it's a certain kind of cake, unnecessary. The style, she says, is, of course, the book. If you remove the cake, all you have left is a recipe. If you remove the style, all you have left is a synopsis of the plot. This is partly true of history, she says, only partly true. Largely true of fiction, only largely true, and absolutely true of fantasy. And she says we can look at this two ways. In saying the style is the book, I speak from the reader's point of view. From the writer's point of view, the style is the writer. Style isn't just how you use English when you write. It's not a mannerism or affectation. It's not something you can do without. You can't do without it. There is no is without it. It provides, you could say, the being, the fabric of what is being written, what is being articulated. It is how you see, your vision, your understanding of the world, your voice. And she says, listen, you can learn style, you can imitate style, all of that's possible, but there has to be style. And that's what's lacking or defective in the Poughkeepsie approach, and that's what the mixed style is confused about in her view. We should end by talking about the role of plain language. Now, not everybody that she mentions with great style is using plain language. Some of them are using archaic language, but they walk the tightrope well. They manage to pull it off because of their style, which probably cannot be adequately imitated except by other great stylists themselves. But Tolkien provides an example here of a very straightforward and plain language, as she says. So a little bit earlier, Tolkien writes a plain, clear English. Its outstanding virtue is its flexibility, its variety. It ranges easily from the commonplace to the stately and can slide into metrical poetry, as in the Tom Bombadil episode, without the careless readers even noticing. Tolkien's vocabulary is not striking. He has no ichor. Everything is direct, concrete, and simple. And so that is certainly one way to do it. Here we also see a resemblance to epic poetry, right? She says, did Henry V of England really talk like Shakespeare's Henry? Did the real Achilles use hexameters? Would the real Beowulf please stand up and alliterate? We're not discussing history, but heroic fantasy. We're discussing a modern descendant of the epic. Most epics are in straightforward language, whether prose or verse. Homer's metaphors may be extended, but they are neither static nor ornate. The Song of Roland has 4,000 lines containing one simile and no metaphors. The Mabinogion and the Norse sagas are as plain-spoken as could well be. Clarity and simplicity are permanent virtues in a narrative. A plain language is the noblest of all. So if we're going to depart from plain language, it has to come organically. It has to fit. It cannot be something put on for the marketplace, right? Or to imitate and thereby win ourselves a place in the fantasy pantheon. Because fantasy is one of those things where true greatness winds up being recognized by people, and mediocrity also winds up being recognized, despite the number of book sales, by looking where people keep going back, right? We keep still reading Tolkien and Leguin and Vance and some of these other authors as well. So a lot of important themes running through Elfland to Poughkeepsie. There's nothing wrong with Poughkeepsie. She's not saying get rid of it. But Elfland has to stand on its own in literary works. And we don't want Poughkeepsie becoming the model for Elfland, or Elfland ceases to be what it is.